September 17, 1944. Somewhere between Arnhem and Nijmegen, Netherlands. The forest floor was soft with decades of decomposed leaves, the canopy above filtering autumn light into shafts of gold and shadow. Sergeant Thomas Aldridge of the British 1st Airborne Division lay bleeding behind the roots of an ancient oak, his left leg shattered by shrapnel from a German 80mm artillery shell, his consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. He had been separated from his unit during the chaos of Operation Market Garden's collapse, had crawled nearly 200 meters through undergrowth while German patrols swept the area, had finally surrendered to the reality that he would die alone in a foreign forest, 24 years old, his body gradually emptying of blood into Dutch soil. Through the haze of shock and blood loss, he heard boots approaching, the distinctive rhythm of military march, German voices speaking in urgent tones. This was the end, then. Capture if he was fortunate, a bullet if he was not. The boots stopped beside him. A voice spoke in accented English. "British soldier, I am nurse. Stay quiet. I help you." He opened his eyes and saw a woman in Wehrmacht medical auxiliary uniform kneeling beside him, her hands already moving to assess his wounds, her face determined and impossibly calm. Nothing in his training, his experience, his understanding of war, had prepared him for what happened next. Thomas Aldridge had been trained as a sniper in the Scottish Highlands, educated in the arts of patience, observation, calculated violence. His instructors had emphasized the psychological dimension of his role, the necessity of viewing enemy soldiers not as individual humans but as targets, threats to be eliminated with precision and without hesitation. Snipers could not afford empathy, the personal nature of their kills, seeing faces through scopes, witnessing the moment of death, required emotional distance that only dehumanization could provide. He had absorbed the training, had killed 17 German soldiers in France and the Low Countries, had felt nothing beyond professional satisfaction at accuracy achieved under difficult conditions. The woman kneeling beside him contradicted every category his military mind possessed. She wore the field gray uniform of the Wehrmacht Medical Service, the Red Cross armband marking her as non-combatant, but her presence with a frontline combat unit suggested she had witnessed horrors he could only imagine. She was perhaps 30 years old, her face lined with exhaustion, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had treated hundreds of casualties under fire. She spoke to him in careful English while her fingers probed his shattered leg, assessing damage. "Bone is broken many pieces. Artery is not cut. This is good. You have chance if I stop bleeding and you reach hospital." Thomas tried to speak, managed only a whisper. "Why? Help me. I'm enemy." The woman, he would later learn her name was Margaret Hoffmann, a nurse from Hamburg, met his eyes with an expression of profound weariness. "You are wounded, soldier. This is enough reason." She called to someone in German and 2 soldiers appeared, older men, visibly reluctant, arguing with her in voices Thomas could not fully understand. Margaret's response was sharp, commanding, brooking no disagreement. The soldiers, though outranking her, deferred. They lifted Thomas with surprising gentleness, carried him through the forest to a barn that had been converted into a field hospital. The barn contained perhaps 30 wounded men, mostly Germans but also several British paratroopers captured during Market Garden's failure, a Canadian pilot shot down over the Rhine, even 2 Dutch civilians caught in crossfire. Margaret moved among them with clinical efficiency, triaging, treating, comforting, apparently operating under the conviction that nationality became irrelevant once men started bleeding. Thomas watched her work, his understanding of war and enmity quietly disintegrating, replaced by something he had no words for. The barn existed in a strange liminal space, a bubble of medical necessity insulated temporarily from the war's ideological fury. The German medical officer in charge, a Hauptmann in his 50s who had served in the First World War, maintained strict protocols derived from the Geneva Convention. Prisoners received the same treatment as German soldiers. Medical decisions were based solely on clinical priority. Nationality played no role in triage. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Some German medical units maintained professional ethics even as the Wehrmacht committed atrocities elsewhere. Thomas would later learn that this particular unit had been assembled from medical personnel deemed politically unreliable. The officer had Jewish ancestors. Several nurses had relatives arrested for political dissent. The enlisted men were older, too cynical or exhausted for fanaticism. Margaret returned to Thomas's side after completing her rounds. She had cleaned his wounds, administered morphine from dwindling supplies, immobilized his leg with improvised splints fashioned from barnwood and torn bedsheets. "You will be transported to POW hospital tomorrow," she informed him. "German army is retreating. Soon this area will be retaken by British. You will survive until then if infection does not start." Her tone was matter-of-fact, neither warm nor cold, simply professional. Thomas found his voice, asked the question that had been growing in him. "How long have you been doing this?" Margaret's face shifted, something like grief passing across it before professional neutrality reasserted itself. "Since 1940. France, then Russia, now here. I have treated perhaps 2,000 wounded men. Many die. Some live. I cannot choose which. I can only try." She paused, looking at the barn's rough beams, the wounded men scattered on straw, the inadequate supplies. "War makes wounds. I repair what I can. This is all." "In Russia," Thomas pressed, his morphine-loosened tongue pursuing questions he would normally suppress. "You treated Russian soldiers too?" Margaret's eyes returned to his face, measuring whether he could understand the answer. "When possible, yes. When officers allowed it. When supplies existed. When the wounded were not shot before I could reach them. Sometimes possible, sometimes not." The careful phrasing spoke volumes about what she had witnessed, what she had been forced to accept, what she had managed to preserve of her humanity, despite circumstances designed to destroy it. Thomas closed his eyes, absorbing the implications. This woman had treated soldiers on all sides, had maintained professional ethics in conditions that made such ethics almost impossible, had saved his life despite every ideological framework that should have rendered him disposable. The transport to POW hospital came not the next day but 3 days later. The front lines had shifted unexpectedly. The German retreat became chaotic. Medical units lost contact with command. During those 72 hours, Thomas observed Margaret's work with the attention to detail his sniper training had ingrained. She slept perhaps 4 hours each night, collapsed on straw in the barn's loft. She worked with supplies that dwindled daily, morphine rationed to only the most severe cases, bandages washed and reused until they disintegrated, surgical instruments sterilized over candle flames because proper equipment had been lost during retreat. What struck Thomas most profoundly was her emotional regulation. She moved between patients exhibiting appropriate affect for each, firm and encouraging with those who would survive, gentle and comforting with those who wouldn't, efficiently clinical with those whose outcomes remained uncertain. She never broke down, never showed frustration or despair, maintained the professional distance necessary to function in conditions that would shatter most people. Only once did he see the mask slip. A young German soldier, 16 years old at most, conscripted in the war's desperate final stages, died from abdominal wounds that no field hospital could have treated. He had been calling for his mother, his voice growing weaker through the night, until finally silence. Margaret sat with him those last hours, holding his hand, speaking quietly in German. After he died, she closed his eyes, arranged his body with dignity, then walked outside. Thomas, watching through the barn's broken wall, saw her stand motionless in the rain for perhaps 5 minutes, her shoulders rigid, her face turned upward. Then she returned inside, her expression neutral, and continued working. That evening, during a rare, quiet moment, Thomas spoke to her again. "The boy who died, was he someone's son?" Margaret interrupted, her voice flat. "Someone's child, sent to fight by men who sit in offices, who make speeches about honor and destiny. He was frightened and in pain, and he died far from home, like the British boy yesterday, like the Canadian pilot last week, like all of them." She paused, her hands automatically sorting through meager medical supplies. "I am tired of watching children die for men who will survive the war." The bitterness in her voice was controlled but unmistakable. Thomas realized he was witnessing someone whose idealism had been ground down by relentless exposure to war's consequences, who continued functioning through discipline rather than belief. The evacuation finally came on the 4th day. British forces were advancing rapidly, German units retreating in increasing disorder. The medical staff received orders to fall back to prepared positions east of the Rhine, taking critical patients, leaving others for the advancing Allies. The barn hospital would be abandoned within hours. Margaret worked frantically to stabilize patients for transport, making brutal triage decisions about who could survive movement and who could not. Thomas watched her separate the wounded into two groups, those who would be loaded onto the single truck available, those who would remain. Several German soldiers, understanding they were being left behind, accepted the decision with resignation. One young man, his chest wounds clearly mortal, actually thanked Margaret for her care, acknowledged that evacuating him would waste space better used for those with survival chances. The grace with which he faced abandonment shocked Thomas more than any combat he had witnessed. When Margaret reached Thomas's position, she knelt beside him with visible exhaustion. "You remain here," she said. "British will retake this area within 1 day, perhaps sooner. You will be found. Treated by your own medical corps. Your leg can be saved if they operate quickly." Thomas grabbed her wrist, surprising himself with the intensity of his need to communicate something he barely understood. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life. Why? I could have killed Germans in your family. I could have shot your brother, your father." Margaret's expression shifted, not to anger, but to something like profound sadness. "Perhaps you did. My brother was killed in France, my father died in Russia. Perhaps a British sniper, perhaps not, it makes no difference. They are dead, you are wounded, and I am nurse. These are the facts. Everything else, nation, ideology, revenge, these are stories men tell to justify killing each other. I have no energy for stories. I only have energy for wounds." She stood, prepared to leave. Thomas, desperate to maintain connection to the person who had shown him humanity in war's midst, asked, "Your name? So I can find you after the war. So I can thank you properly." Margaret hesitated, then replied, "Margaret Hoffman, Hamburg." Then she was gone, supervising the truck loading, organizing the retreat, disappearing into the chaos of Germany's collapse. Thomas never saw her leave. British forces overran the barn that evening, and he was evacuated to a proper hospital, where surgeons saved his leg through procedures impossible in field conditions. Thomas Aldridge returned to England in November 1944, underwent multiple surgeries, spent 6 months in rehabilitation learning to walk with permanent damage to his left leg. He was decorated for his service, received medical discharge, returned to civilian life in Nottingham where he had grown up. He found work as a surveyor, married a schoolteacher named Helen, had 3 children, built what appeared from outside to be a normal post-war life. But Margaret Hoffman haunted him, not romantically. He loved his wife, was faithful, built genuine family happiness. But Margaret represented something unresolved, a debt unpaid, a moment of grace in war's brutality that demanded acknowledgement. She had saved his life for no reason except professional ethics, had treated him as human when ideology should have rendered him disposable. He needed to find her, to thank her properly, to understand who she was beyond those desperate days in the Dutch barn. The search began in 1946. As soon as international mail service resumed, Thomas wrote to the International Red Cross, providing Margaret's name, her unit designation, which he had memorized from insignia, her last known location. The response months later was discouraging. Hamburg had been devastated by Allied bombing, civil registries destroyed, populations displaced, hundreds of thousands missing or dead. Margaret Hoffman was a common name. The Red Cross had records of 17 women with that name in Hamburg's pre-war population. No reliable information about which had survived. Thomas expanded his search. He wrote to British military authorities, requesting information about German medical personnel captured or identified during the war's final months. He contacted veteran associations, placed advertisements in German newspapers as they resumed publication, wrote to Hamburg's Reconstruction Administration. Every lead evaporated. The chaos of Germany's collapse and occupation had erased normal record-keeping. Millions of people had disappeared, fled east ahead of Soviet advance, died in bombing raids, perished in the war's final desperate battles, succumbed to starvation and disease in the immediate post-war period. His wife Helen understood the obsession, supported it despite not fully comprehending its intensity. "She saved your life," Helen said simply. "Of course you want to thank her. Keep trying." The children grew up hearing stories about the German nurse, about the barn hospital, about the woman who proved that humanity could survive even in war's worst circumstances. Thomas's search became family legend, a quixotic quest that defined their father, evidence of his integrity and persistence. The breakthrough came in 1959, 15 years after the war, through an unlikely connection. Thomas had attended a veterans reunion in London, where a Dutch resistance fighter mentioned that he maintained contact with civilians in the Arnhem region who had helped hide Allied soldiers during the German occupation. The Dutchman offered to inquire locally about the Barn Hospital, about whether anyone remembered the German medical unit that had operated there. 6 months later, a letter arrived from a Dutch farmer named Henrik van der Berg. He remembered the barn. It had been on his family's property, commandeered by German forces in September 1944. He remembered the wounded soldiers, remembered the retreat, remembered British forces arriving and finding the abandoned casualties. More importantly, he had spoken with the German medical officer in the days before evacuation. The officer had mentioned his unit's destination, a military hospital in Münster, Germany, where they expected to regroup. Armed with this information, Thomas contacted Münster's municipal authorities. Post-war West Germany was by then a functioning democracy, with rebuilt bureaucracy, capable of searching records systematically. The response, arriving in early 1960, was both encouraging and devastating. The military hospital had been bombed in March 1945, destroying most personnel records. However, a surviving nurse from that hospital remembered a Margaret Hoffman, described her as exceptionally skilled, dedicated, haunted by her service on the Eastern Front. This Margaret had survived the war, the nurse believed, and had returned to Hamburg to search for family members. Thomas traveled to Hamburg in summer 1960, his first visit to Germany since the war. The city was still rebuilding, vast sections reduced to rubble by the firestorm bombing of 1943 that had killed 42,000 people in a single night. He visited civil registry offices, hospitals, nursing associations, anyone who might have records or memories. The search was complicated by the fact that Hamburg's population had changed dramatically. Many pre-war residents had died or fled, replaced by refugees from territories lost to Poland and Czechoslovakia, by people relocating for work in the Reconstruction economy. One lead seemed promising. A Margaret Hoffman had been employed by Hamburg University Hospital's emergency department from 1946 to 1952. Thomas visited the hospital, spoke with administrators, learned that this Margaret had left suddenly in 1952, providing a forwarding address in Stuttgart, but no explanation for her departure. The trail went cold again. Stuttgart records showed no Margaret Hoffman matching the description registering residency in the specified year. The search became Thomas's defining passion, the project that organized his life beyond work and family. He learned German, studying at night after his children were asleep, practicing with language records until he could read newspapers and conduct basic conversations. He subscribed to German publications, monitoring news from cities where Margaret might have settled. He developed relationships with German veterans organizations, with nursing associations, with church groups that maintained social service records. Each lead required follow-up, letters written, phone calls made, occasionally trips to Germany when information seemed credible. His obsession was not universally understood. Some fellow veterans considered it strange, even treasonous. Why spend so much effort finding a German when British soldiers needed support? Others understood the search as expiation, an attempt to process war trauma through concrete action. Thomas himself was not entirely sure of his motivations. The practical excuse, thanking someone who saved his life, was real but insufficient. Something deeper drove him, a need to prove that the humanity Margaret had demonstrated was not isolated, that it could be recovered and extended, that connection across war's divisions was possible. The 1960s passed with periodic promising leads that dissolved upon investigation. A Margaret Hoffman working as a nurse in Munich, wrong age. Another in Berlin, never served in the military. A third in Cologne, had served but in a different unit, had never been near Holland. Each disappointment deepened Thomas's determination. His children, now teenagers, began to assist. His eldest daughter studied German literature at university and helped translate documents. His son developed an interest in genealogical research and taught Thomas systematic record-searching techniques. Helen, his wife, remained supportive but increasingly worried. "You're chasing a ghost," she said gently in 1970, watching Thomas prepare for another trip to Germany. "Even if you find her, what then? She may not remember you. She treated hundreds of soldiers. You were one afternoon in a war." Thomas acknowledged the possibility but could not abandon the search. "She remembered my face well enough to save my life when she could have walked past." he replied. If she doesn't remember me, that's acceptable. But I need to find her, need to say thank you, need to close the circle. The phrase resonated, closing the circle. His war experience remained incomplete, suspended, unresolved. Finding Margaret would provide closure, would transform a story of random survival into something meaningful, evidence that individual moral choices mattered, that kindness persisted, that war's brutality was not absolute. The convergence of persistence and chance occurred in 1978, 34 years after the Barn Hospital. Thomas had placed another series of advertisements in German newspapers, this time worded differently, not seeking Margarete directly, but asking for anyone who had served in Wehrmacht medical units in Holland during autumn 1944 to contact him for a historical research project. He received 3 responses. 2 led nowhere. The third, from a retired nurse named Elisabeth Schroeder living in Frankfurt, mentioned that she had served with several medical units and remembered a Margaret Hoffman who matched the description. We served together briefly in 1944, Elisabeth wrote. Margaret was extraordinary, the most skilled trauma nurse I encountered in 6 years of war. She had served in Russia, had seen terrible things, rarely spoke about her experiences. After the war, I heard she had settled in Switzerland working in a Red Cross hospital. She wanted distance from Germany, from memories. I have no address, but I remember the city, Geneva. Thomas felt electricity run through him. Switzerland, neutral during the war, relatively prosperous afterward. A logical refuge for someone seeking to escape Germany's devastation and the memories it contained. He wrote immediately to Geneva's Red Cross facilities, to Swiss nursing registries, to expatriate German community organizations. The response from Red Cross headquarters arrived 6 weeks later. A Margaret Hoffman had indeed worked at their Geneva hospital from 1952 to 1975, retiring at age 61. She had left Switzerland upon retirement, returning to Germany, to a small town in Bavaria called Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Thomas's hands shook as he read the letter. After 34 years of searching, he had found her. The Red Cross provided no address, citing privacy concerns, but offered to forward a letter if Thomas wished to make contact. He sat down immediately and wrote, his German now fluent from decades of practice. Dear Frau Hoffman, you will not remember me, but I remember you with perfect clarity. In September 1944, you saved my life in a barn hospital near Arnhem. I was Sergeant Thomas Aldridge, British 1st Airborne, with a shattered leg and no hope until you appeared. You treated me with skill and kindness despite every reason not to. I have spent 34 years searching for you, needing to say thank you, needing to tell you that your humanity in the midst of horror changed how I understand the world. If you are willing, I would like to meet you. I owe you my life and would be honored to shake your hand. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Bavaria. Thomas held it for several minutes before opening, suddenly afraid. What if she didn't remember? What if she did remember but wanted no contact, no reminder of the war? What if 34 years of searching ended in polite rejection? Helen stood beside him, placed her hand on his shoulder. Whatever it says, you tried. You found her. That's what mattered. He opened the envelope. The handwriting was clear, elegant, unmistakably German in its precision. Dear Mr. Aldridge, I remember you. The British sergeant with the shattered leg, the one who asked why I helped you, who seemed surprised that I treated wounds rather than nationalities. I am astonished that you searched for me, that you remembered my name, that after so many years you still wish to say thank you. Of course I will meet you. Please come to Garmisch. I will be honored to see the man whose life I saved, to learn what he built with the years I gave him. Margaret Hoffman. Thomas wept. Helen wept with him, sharing his release of tension accumulated over decades. Their children, now adults with children of their own, gathered to hear the news. They would all travel to Germany together, Thomas decided. His entire family would meet the woman who made their existence possible, who had chosen humanity when ideology demanded hatred. The meeting was arranged for October 1978. Thomas, Helen, their 3 children and 2 grandchildren traveled to Bavaria, to the small alpine town where Margaret had built her retirement life. She had given them an address, a modest house on the edge of town, overlooking mountains surrounded by a garden meticulously maintained. Thomas stood at the gate for a long moment, gathering courage, then walked up the path and knocked. The woman who opened the door was 70 years old, her hair white, her face deeply lined, her hands showing arthritis. But Thomas recognized her instantly, the same intelligent eyes, the same expression of calm competence, the same essential presence that had radiated authority in the Barn Hospital 34 years earlier. They stood looking at each other, two people whose lives had intersected for 72 hours in 1944, who had been shaped irrevocably by that intersection. "Sergeant Aldridge," Margaret said in English, still accented but fluent. "Your leg healed well, you can walk." "Thanks to you," Thomas replied. "Everything I have, my life, my family, my future, thanks to you." Margaret smiled, opened the door wider. "Then come inside. Tell me about this life I gave you. I would like to know it was worth saving." They sat in Margaret's small living room drinking tea, while Thomas introduced his family, his wife Helen, his children now in their 30s, his grandchildren who stared with wide eyes at the elderly woman their grandfather had searched for across continents and decades. Margaret listened to Thomas describe his life, his recovery, his career, his marriage, the ordinary happiness he had built from the survival she had enabled. She asked questions about his children's lives, his grandchildren's interests, showing genuine curiosity about the consequences of her decision to save one wounded soldier in a forgotten barn. When Thomas finished, Margaret sat quietly for a moment before speaking. "I treated perhaps 2,000 wounded soldiers during the war," she said slowly. "Most died, some survived. I rarely learned which. You are the first who ever found me afterward, who took the trouble to say thank you. I am touched, more than I can express." Her voice carried emotion carefully controlled, the same emotional regulation Thomas had observed 34 years earlier. "Tell me about your life," Thomas asked. "After the war, why Switzerland? Why return to Germany?" Margaret's expression shifted, became more guarded. "After what I saw in Russia, after what I learned our army had done, I could not remain in Germany. The knowledge of the camps, of the murders, of the ideology I had served even as I tried to maintain ethics, it was too much. I needed distance. Switzerland offered neutrality, clean mountains, work that was only healing with no connection to war." She paused, looking at her hands. "But eventually I realized running was useless. Germany was my home. German was my language. Germans were my people. I could not escape by geography. So I returned in 1975 to this small town where no one knows my history, where I am simply the retired nurse who tends her garden. I volunteer at the local clinic. I read. I walk in the mountains. It is quiet life, perhaps too quiet, but it is enough." Thomas heard the loneliness beneath her words, the isolation of someone who had witnessed too much, who had maintained humanity through impossible circumstances, who had survived into a peace she had helped create but could not fully enjoy. On impulse, driven by instinct rather than planning, he said, "You should visit England, stay with us, meet our community. Let us show you what your kindness made possible." Margaret's eyes widened with surprise. "You would welcome me? A German? After everything?" Helen spoke for the first time. "You saved my husband. You made my family possible. How could we not welcome you?" Margaret's first visit to England in spring 1979 became the foundation of a relationship that would endure for the rest of her life. Thomas and Helen welcomed her as honored guest, introducing her to their community in Nottingham, friends, neighbors, members of Thomas's Veterans Association. The response was overwhelmingly positive. British veterans who had fought in the war listened to Margaret's story, recognized that military medical personnel who maintained Geneva Convention ethics deserved respect regardless of nationality, understood that individual moral choices mattered more than national allegiance. One veteran, a former Lancaster bomber navigator named Jeffrey Price, spoke to Margaret privately during her visit. "My crew bombed Hamburg in 1943, he said, his voice heavy with decades of guilt. "We created the firestorm that killed 40,000 civilians. I have lived with that knowledge for 36 years. I tell myself we were following orders, that we believed we were shortening the war, but those explanations don't erase what we did." He paused, meeting Margaret's eyes. "You saved wounded enemies when you could have ignored them. You maintained humanity when circumstances made it almost impossible. That gives me hope. Hope that moral choices matter even in war, that kindness can survive brutality. Thank you for that." Margaret listened, her face showing understanding without judgment. "We all did what we could with the circumstances we faced," she replied. "You dropped bombs, I treated wounds. Both of us followed orders while trying to preserve our humanity. The war was larger than any individual choice, but perhaps those individual choices, the moments of mercy, of restraint, of recognition of shared humanity, Perhaps those are what allow us to live with ourselves afterward. The conversation, witnessed by Thomas, crystallized something he had been feeling for decades, that the search for Margaret had been about more than gratitude. It had been about proving that moral complexity existed even in war, that people on both sides had faced impossible choices, that humanity persisted despite systematic efforts to destroy it. Finding Margaret, bringing her into his family and community, was a statement, a rejection of war's categorical thinking, an embrace of the possibility that former enemies could become family. Margaret returned to England 4 more times over the following years, each visit lasting several weeks. She attended Thomas's daughter's wedding, met his grandchildren as they grew, became integrated into the family in ways that surprised everyone. The children called her Oma Margarete, Grandmother Margarete, and she embraced the role with visible joy, finding in Thomas's family the connections her own disrupted life had never provided. The moment of deepest recognition came during Margaret's visit in 1983, during a family gathering for Thomas's 60th birthday. The house was full, children, grandchildren, friends, neighbors, a celebration of life and survival. Thomas, standing to give a thank you speech, found himself overwhelmed by the scene. 3 generations of family made possible by one woman's decision to treat a wounded enemy soldier with professional ethics and human kindness. He called Margaret to stand beside him, took her hand in his. "I want everyone here to understand something," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything in this room, every person, every relationship, every moment of joy, exists because this woman chose humanity over ideology 40 years ago. She could have walked past me in that Dutch barn. No one would have blamed her. I was the enemy. We had bombed her city, killed people she loved, but she stopped. She treated my wounds. She saved my life." Thomas paused, composing himself. "I spent 34 years searching for her, and people asked me why. Why devote so much time and effort to finding one person? Here's why. Because Margaret proved that individual moral choices matter, that humanity survives even in war's worst moments, that kindness is never wasted. She proved that we are not prisoners of ideology or nationality, that we can choose to see the human being rather than the uniform." He turned to Margaret, tears streaming freely now. "You gave me life. Not just biological life, you gave me a life worth living, built on the foundation of your compassion. You gave me my wife, my children, my grandchildren. You gave me decades of love and purpose and meaning, and you gave me hope, hope that people can transcend the divisions war creates, that former enemies can become family. I cannot possibly thank you enough, but I will spend whatever time remains trying." Margaret, crying now herself, embraced Thomas. "You thanked me by finding me," she whispered, "by remembering, by making me part of your family. You showed me that my choice mattered, that maintaining my ethics during the war was not futile. You gave meaning to suffering by showing me what good came from it. We saved each other, Thomas, you as much as me. You." The room fell silent, everyone present understanding they were witnessing something rare, the healing of war's deepest wounds through persistence, compassion, and the recognition of shared humanity, not through forgetting, not through denial, but through confronting the past directly and choosing connection over division. Margaret Hoffman died in 1991 at age 83, surrounded by Thomas's family in Nottingham, rather than alone in Bavaria. She had moved to England permanently in 1985, accepting the Aldridges' invitation to live with them in her final years. She spent those years as beloved grandmother to Thomas's grandchildren, as honored member of the community, as living testimony to the possibility that war's enmities could be transformed through individual courage and persistent effort to build bridges. Thomas outlived her by 7 years, dying peacefully in 1998 at age 74. His obituary, published in British and German newspapers, told the story of the sniper and the nurse, the extraordinary 40-year search, the reunion, the family they built together. The story resonated internationally, was featured in documentaries, inspired books and articles about reconciliation and the human capacity for forgiveness and connection across profound divides. But the real legacy lived in the family itself. Thomas's children, shaped by the story of their father's search and Margaret's eventual integration into their family, built lives committed to cross-cultural understanding and reconciliation work. His eldest daughter became a translator for the European Union, facilitating communication between former enemy nations now united in common purpose. His son worked for international medical charities, carrying forward Margaret's commitment to treating suffering regardless of nationality or politics. Their children, Thomas's grandchildren, who had known Margaret as a grandmother, grew up understanding that family was built not only through blood but through choice, commitment, and the recognition of shared humanity. The barn in Holland, where the story began, still stands, now marked with a plaque placed by Dutch authorities in 2004. Here in September 1944, German military medical personnel treated wounded soldiers of all nations with equal care, demonstrating that humanity can survive even in war's darkest moments. In memory of those who chose compassion over hatred, the plaque includes Margaret's name and Thomas's, their stories intertwined forever, evidence that individual moral choices ripple across decades, creating consequences far beyond what anyone could imagine in the moment of choice. The lesson they taught was simple but profound, that searching for those who show us kindness, that expressing gratitude even across enemy lines, that refusing to accept war's divisions as permanent, these acts matter. They transform personal history into family, trauma into healing, enmity into love. Thomas spent 40 years searching for Margaret, not because he was obsessed, but because he understood something essential, that the threads connecting us to those who save us, literally or figuratively, must be followed, must be honored, must be woven into the fabric of our lives.